Margaret Maggie. Sullivan adjusted the simple blue dress she had chosen for her son's graduation from officer candidate school. At 57, with silver threading through her once auburn hair, she looked like any other proud mother in the audience. She had driven 6 hours from her small hometown in Pennsylvania to Quantico, Virginia, for one reason only: to watch her only child, James, become a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps. The morning sun beat down on the parade grounds as families gathered in their seats. Maggie clutched her small purse, inside which was a worn photograph she had carried for over 30 years. Today wasn't about her past, it was about James and his future. Still, she couldn't help but feel the weight of memory as she watched the preparations for the ceremony. "First time at OCS graduation?" asked the friendly woman who took the seat beside her. "Yes," Maggie replied with a polite smile. "My son is graduating today." "Oh, how wonderful, my nephew too. These boys have no idea what they're in for, do they?" the woman laughed. "My husband served 20 years. Marines get in your blood, they say." "They certainly do," Maggie agreed quietly. "Did your husband serve?" "No," Maggie said. "James's father was a high school history teacher. He passed away when James was 12. "I'm sorry to hear that," the woman said. "He'd be proud today, I'm sure." "Yes, he would." As the conversation lulled, Maggie's hand moved to the small silver pin she had fastened to her dress's collar. It wasn't ostentatious, just a small, distinctive emblem that most wouldn't recognize. She had debated wearing it, but something about watching her son follow a path that had once been her own made her want to carry this small piece of her history. The ceremony began with the Marine Corps band playing as the graduating class marched onto the field in perfect formation. Maggie's eyes found James immediately, tall and straight-backed in the third row, his face solemn with the gravity of the occasion. Pride swelled in her chest. Whatever else happened today, this moment made everything worthwhile. Colonel Richardson, the commanding officer, approached the podium to begin his remarks. Behind him sat a row of Marine officers who would participate in the ceremony. Maggie's gaze passed over them until it stopped on a captain seated at the end, a man about her age with close-cropped gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had seen his share of conflict. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Maggie felt a jolt of recognition. Quickly, she looked away, focusing her attention back on the colonel's speech. It couldn't be him. The Marines was a large organization, and 30 years was a long time. The coincidence would be too great. As the ceremony progressed, Maggie became aware that the captain was now studying her intently. She kept her eyes firmly on the podium, on her son, on anything else. But she could feel his gaze, persistent and questioning. "And now," the colonel announced, "Captain Michael Herrera will lead the commissioning oath for our new officers." Maggie's breath caught in her throat. Michael Herrera. So it was him after all. She watched as he rose from his chair and took the podium, his movements still carrying the crisp precision she remembered. As he began to speak, his voice transported her back across decades to a different time, a different world. The graduating candidates stood at attention as Captain Herrera led them through the oath of office. James's voice, clear and strong, mingled with the others as they swore to support and defend the Constitution. Maggie felt tears stinging her eyes, pride for her son mixed with memories she had carefully packed away long ago. When the oath concluded, the new officers were dismissed to receive their first salutes and celebrate with their families. Maggie rose from her seat, intending to find James among the crowd. But as she turned to leave her row, she saw Captain Herrera making his way directly toward her, moving with purpose through the dispersing audience. She considered leaving quickly, losing herself in the crowd, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Perhaps it was time, after all these years, to face the past she had left behind. Captain Herrera stopped a few feet away, his eyes fixed on the small silver pin on her collar. His face had gone pale, as though he were seeing a ghost. "Nighthawk," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And with that single word, a call sign she hadn't heard in 3 decades, Margaret Sullivan knew that her carefully constructed life was about to change forever. "Hello, Mike," Maggie said quietly, conscious of the families moving around them. Captain Herrera seemed unable to speak for a moment, his eyes moving from the insignia to her face and back again. "My God, it really is you," he finally managed. "Margaret Donovan." "Sullivan now," she corrected. "I've been Margaret Sullivan for 25 years. We thought you were dead." he said, the words tumbling out as though he couldn't contain them. After Grenada, when you disappeared, the official word was that you'd been killed in action. Maggie glanced around nervously. This isn't the place, Mike. I'm here for my son's graduation. Your son, his eyes widened further. One of my new lieutenants is your son. James Sullivan, third row. Herrera's face registered shock, then something like understanding. 6'2", excellent tactical scores, quiet leadership style. I should have seen the resemblance. He has your eyes. Before Maggie could respond, she heard James calling her. Mom, over here. She turned to see her son making his way toward her, resplendent in his dress uniform, a wide smile lighting his face. Maggie felt a moment of panic. This was James's day. She didn't want her past intruding on his achievement. Captain, she said urgently, please not now, he doesn't know. Herrera's expression shifted as he grasped the situation. With a slight nod, he stepped back, composing himself just as James reached them. Mom, I've been looking for you. James embraced her warmly, then noticed Captain Herrera standing nearby. He immediately straightened, offering a crisp salute. Captain Herrera, sir. At ease, Lieutenant Sullivan, Herrera returned the salute. I was just congratulating your mother on raising such a fine Marine officer. Thank you, sir, James replied, beaming with pride. I couldn't have done it without her support. Maggie watched the exchange with a strange sense of dissonance, her past and present colliding in ways she had never anticipated. The silver insignia on her collar, which had seemed like such a small, private gesture this morning, now felt like it was burning against her skin. Lieutenant, would you excuse us for just one moment? Herrera asked. I believe your mother and I have a mutual acquaintance I'd like to ask her about. James looked confused but nodded. Of course, sir. Mom, I'll be right over there with some of my classmates. Come meet them when you're ready. As James walked away, Maggie turned to Herrera, her composure slipping. Mike, please, whatever you think you know. What I know, he interrupted quietly, is that Captain Margaret Donovan was one of the most decorated Marines I ever served with. What I know is that she was reported killed during Operation Urgent Fury in 1983. And what I know is that she's somehow standing in front of me, very much alive, wearing the Nighthawk Squadron insignia that only 12 people in the world were ever authorized to wear. Maggie's hand moved unconsciously to touch the small silver pin, a stylized hawk with wings spread against a crescent moon. Does he know anything about who you were, what you did? Herrera asked. No, Maggie admitted. He knows I was in the military briefly, but nothing more, after everything that happened. I needed a clean break, a fresh start. Herrera looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and something else, perhaps respect, perhaps anger, it was hard to tell. The first female officer to complete force recon training, the pilot who flew some of the most dangerous extraction missions in our history, and your son has no idea. I made my choice, Mike. I had my reasons. Herrera glanced over at James, who was watching them curiously from a distance. He deserves to know who his mother really is. The things you did, the lives you saved, including mine, that's not something you should have buried. Maggie felt a flash of the old steel in her spine. You don't get to make that decision for me, Captain, not after 30 years. No, he conceded. I don't. But fate has a funny way of bringing things full circle, doesn't it? Your son chose the Marines on his own. He excelled in exactly the kind of tactical thinking and leadership that made you legendary. And now he's about to be assigned to a unit where your history will eventually come to light. Maggie stared at him. What do you mean? Lieutenant Sullivan has been selected for special operations training. His file is already flagged for the reconnaissance community. People there still talk about Nighthawk, Margaret. The missions are still studied. Your call sign is still whispered like some kind of ghost story to new operators. The implications hit Maggie like a physical blow. James would be entering the very community where her past was most likely to be discovered. Even with the passage of time, the classified nature of her operations, someone would eventually make the connection. There's something else you should know, Herrera continued, his voice gentler now. Colonel Matthews is here today. He's the keynote speaker for the evening ceremony. Maggie felt the blood drain from her face. Colonel David Matthews had been her commanding officer in the Nighthawk Squadron, the experimental Joint Special Operations Aviation Unit that had pushed the boundaries of what was possible in military operations. If Matthews saw her. I need time to think, she said, fighting to maintain her composure. This is James's day. I won't have it overshadowed. Herrera nodded slowly. I understand. But Margaret, he hesitated, then continued. The truth has a way of coming out, especially in our world. Better he hears it from you than stumbles across it in some classified briefing or from an old Marine who recognizes your name. As if on cue, James began walking back toward them. Maggie took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders in a gesture that unconsciously echoed her military bearing. Thank you for your concern, Captain, she said formally. Now, if you'll excuse me, my son is waiting. Herrera looked like he wanted to say more, but instead he nodded. Of course, Mrs. Sullivan, Lieutenant, he acknowledged James with a nod as they passed each other. What was that about, Mom? James asked, curious. The captain seemed pretty intense. Maggie managed a smile. Just reminiscing about old times. Now introduce me to your friends. This is your day, and I want to hear everything about your plans. As they walked toward a group of newly commissioned officers, Maggie was acutely aware of Herrera watching them from a distance. The small silver insignia on her collar, the stylized nighthawk that had once been her identity, her pride, now felt like it was revealing secrets she had kept buried for 3 decades. She had come only to watch her son graduate. Now she would have to decide whether to continue living with her carefully constructed half-truths or finally reveal to her son the woman she had once been, and perhaps in her heart still was. The afternoon reception following the graduation ceremony was held in a large hall adjacent to the parade grounds. Maggie stood by James's side as he introduced her to his classmates and their families, smiling and making appropriate conversation while her mind raced. She kept scanning the room, half expecting to see Colonel Matthews appear at any moment. Thus far, she had been lucky. The colonel was apparently occupied with official duties before the evening ceremony. Mom, are you okay? James asked during a quiet moment. You seem distracted. Just overwhelmed with pride, Maggie assured him, patting his arm. It's not every day your son becomes a Marine officer. James smiled, but his expression remained slightly puzzled. What did Captain Herrera really want to talk to you about? You two seem to know each other. Before Maggie could formulate a response, a familiar voice spoke from behind them. Lieutenant Sullivan, congratulations on your commission. They turned to find Captain Herrera approaching, now accompanied by an older officer with Colonel's eagles on his shoulders. Maggie felt her heart stop as she recognized Colonel David Matthews, his face lined with age but still unmistakable. James snapped to attention. Thank you, sir. Matthews smiled at the young officer, then turned his gaze to Maggie. For a moment, he simply stared, his expression moving from polite interest to dawning recognition to complete shock. My God, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Donovan. James looked between them, confusion evident on his face. Sir. Matthews seemed unable to tear his eyes away from Maggie. Captain Margaret Donovan, Nighthawk Squadron, presumed KIA, October 1983. The room seemed to fall silent around them, though in reality the reception continued unabated, oblivious to the small drama unfolding in their midst. I don't understand, James said, turning to his mother. Mom. Maggie took a deep breath, realizing the moment she had both feared and in some hidden corner of her heart, perhaps waited for had finally arrived. James, there are things about my past that I haven't told you. What things? His voice held confusion, but also the first edge of hurt. Who's Margaret Donovan? Perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere more private, Herrera suggested quietly, gesturing toward a small meeting room off the main hall. Moments later, the 4 of them stood in the empty room, the sounds of the reception muffled by the closed door. James looked between the 3 older adults, his expression increasingly troubled. Would someone please explain what's going on? He demanded. Matthews, who had been staring at Maggie as though seeing a ghost, finally found his voice. Your mother was Captain Margaret Donovan, one of the most exceptional officers I ever commanded. She was the pilot and tactical leader of a classified special operations unit known as Nighthawk Squadron. James turned to Maggie, disbelief written across his features. Mom, is this true? Maggie nodded slowly, her hand again moving to the silver insignia on her collar. Yes. Before I met your father, before I became Margaret Sullivan, I was Captain Margaret Donovan, United States Marine Corps. But you told me you served briefly as an administrative specialist right after college, James said, the confusion in his voice giving way to hurt. You said you left after 2 years to go to graduate school. That was not the truth, Maggie admitted. I served for 8 years, from 1975 to 1983. I was one of the first women to complete several advanced training programs that had previously been closed to female Marines. Matthews stepped forward. Your mother broke barriers that most thought couldn't be broken. When the Experimental Joint Special Operations Command was forming Nighthawk Squadron for covert aviation operations, she was selected as one of only 12 pilots, the only woman, because her skills were simply that exceptional. James looked stunned. You were a pilot, a special operations pilot. Maggie nodded. Helicopters primarily, though I was qualified on several fixed-wing aircraft as well. But why would you hide this? James asked, the hurt in his voice now unmistakable. Why would you let me believe? He stopped, another realization hitting him. They said you were killed in action, in Grenada. Colonel Matthews answered. Officially, yes. Captain Donovan's helicopter was shot down during an extraction mission in Operation Urgent Fury. The aircraft was destroyed and her body was never recovered. She was listed as killed in action. But obviously I wasn't killed, Maggie said quietly. My helicopter was hit, but I managed to crash land in the water. I was severely injured and picked up by a local fishing boat. By the time I regained consciousness, I was in a small village clinic, and the American forces had completed their operation and withdrawn. Why didn't you contact anyone? James asked. Let them know you were alive. Maggie looked down at her hands, the memories she had kept at bay for so long now flooding back. It's complicated, James. The mission I was on. It wasn't officially sanctioned. Nighthawk Squadron operated in the gray areas, sometimes without formal authorization. When I went down, I was extracting a team that officially wasn't there. After the crash, she continued, her voice growing steadier as she spoke, I spent weeks recovering from my injuries. During that time, I had a lot of time to think. The life I had been living, the constant danger, the secrecy, the moral compromises, it was taking a toll on me. When I learned I had been declared dead, part of me saw it as an opportunity. An opportunity to desert? James's voice was sharp with shock. No, Herrera interjected. An opportunity to start over. You have to understand, Lieutenant, the operations we were involved in. They carried burdens that were difficult to bear. Matthews nodded. The Nighthawk Squadron operated at the very edge of what was authorized. We saved many lives, but the methods sometimes left scars, not physical ones, but here. He tapped his temple, then his chest. Your mother had flown more missions, faced more danger, made more impossible decisions than any of us. Maggie looked directly at her son. I was burned out, James. Today they would call it PTSD. Back then we didn't have words for it, just the weight of everything we'd seen and done. When I realized the world thought I was dead, something in me accepted it. Captain Donovan had died in that crash. I could become someone new. So you just disappeared? James asked, struggling to reconcile this new version of his mother with the woman who had raised him. I made my way back to the States through unofficial channels. I used some of my training to create a new identity, Margaret Sullivan, a graduate student with a mundane past. I moved to Pennsylvania, far from the military communities where I might be recognized, and I built a new life. Where you met Dad, James said, the pieces starting to fit together. Yes, your father was kind, gentle, intellectual, everything that represented the peaceful life I was seeking. When we fell in love, I told him I wanted to leave my past behind completely. He agreed to help me do that. Dad knew, all this time he knew who you really were. Maggie nodded. He was the only one who knew the full truth. He understood why I needed to leave that life behind, why I couldn't bear to carry those memories anymore. But why keep it from me? The hurt in James's voice was palpable. Even after Dad died, I was 18 then, old enough to understand. By then, it had been my reality for so long, Maggie said softly. I had been Margaret Sullivan, librarian and mother, for nearly 20 years. The woman I had been before felt like someone from another lifetime. And I was afraid of legal consequences, afraid of your judgment, afraid of reopening wounds that had finally healed. Colonel Matthews cleared his throat. For what it's worth, Lieutenant, there would be no legal consequences now. The statute of limitations on any administrative charges expired long ago. and given the classified nature of the operations, the government would have little interest in pursuing the matter after all this time. James stood silently, absorbing everything he had heard. The three older adults watched him, giving him space to process the revelation that had upended his understanding of his mother's life. "The night before I left for OCS," James finally said, "you told me you were proud that I had found my own path to service. That wasn't true, was it? I was following in your footsteps without even knowing it." "I was proud, James, I am proud," Maggie insisted. "And yes, seeing you choose the Marines on your own without any influence from me, it meant more than you could know. It felt like validation somehow. Like the values I had tried to instill in you, even without sharing my past, had taken root." James looked at the insignia on her collar, the small silver nighthawk that had started this cascade of revelations. "Why wear that today? After hiding for so long, why risk being recognized?" Maggie touched the pin gently. "I'm not entirely sure. Perhaps because watching you graduate, seeing you become an officer in the Corps I once loved so deeply, it awakened something in me. Wearing this was a small act of reclaiming a part of myself I had buried, a private acknowledgement of the connection between your path and my own. I never imagined Captain Herrera would recognize it," she added with a rueful smile. "The Nighthawk insignia was never officially documented. Only squadron members had them." "We thought they had all been lost," Matthew said quietly. "After you were declared KIA, we were disbanded. The operations were deemed too risky, the potential for blowback too great. The remaining members were reassigned to conventional units with strict orders never to discuss Nighthawk Squadron." James studied the three older adults, his expression thoughtful. "All these years, I've wondered why I felt so drawn to the Marines, why certain aspects of training seemed to come naturally to me. I thought it was just aptitude, but it was in my blood all along, wasn't it?" Maggie reached for his hand. "Your choices are your own, James. Whether genetics or environment or simple coincidence led you to the Marines, what you've accomplished is yours alone." "Lieutenant," Colonel Matthews said, "I understand this is a lot to process, but you should know that your mother was one of the finest Marine officers I ever had the privilege to serve with. The lives she saved, the missions she accomplished, her record, classified though it remains, is extraordinary." James looked at his mother with new eyes, seeing beyond the librarian who had raised him to the Marine officer she had once been. "I have so many questions." "I know," Maggie said, "and I'll answer them all, I promise, but perhaps not all at once and not all today." A knock at the door interrupted them. A young lieutenant poked his head in. "Colonel Matthews, sir. They're ready for you at the evening ceremony." Matthews nodded. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I'll be right there." As the door closed, he turned back to Maggie. "Margaret, when I saw you in that reception hall, I thought I was seeing a ghost. Now I understand it was something of a resurrection." He extended his hand. "Whatever your reasons, I'm glad to know you survived. The world is better with you in it, even under a different name." Maggie shook his hand, emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "Thank you, David." "Captain Herrera," Matthews continued, "I trust this conversation will remain between us for now." "Of course, sir," Herrera affirmed. "Lieutenant Sullivan," Matthews addressed James, "congratulations again on your commission. You're entering the Corps at an interesting time. I have a feeling you'll do the uniform proud, just as your mother did." With that, the colonel excused himself, leaving Maggie, James, and Captain Herrera alone in the small room. "I should give you two some privacy," Herrera said. "Margaret, it's good to see you again, despite the circumstances. You saved my life in Lebanon, something I've never forgotten." As Herrera departed, James and Maggie stood facing each other, the weight of revelation hanging between them. "I don't know whether to be angry that you kept this from me or amazed at who you really are," James finally said. "I'm still the same person who raised you," Maggie replied gently. "That part wasn't a lie. I'm still your mother. I just have a more complicated past than you knew." "A Marine aviator, a special operations officer." James shook his head in disbelief. "All those times I talked about military history, about operations and tactics. You must have been biting your tongue." A small smile touched Maggie's lips. "Sometimes, but mostly I was proud of your interest, your understanding of the principles involved." "Mom," James said, his voice serious, "I need time to process all this. But I want you to know, despite the shock, despite feeling like I didn't really know you, I'm glad I know now." Maggie felt tears threatening. I should have told you sooner, I see that now. Yes, you should have, James agreed. But I understand why it was hard, and now we have a lot of catching up to do. He gestured to the door. We should probably get back. The evening ceremony will be starting soon, and I'm supposed to be there with my platoon. As they walked back toward the main hall, James paused. That insignia, the Nighthawk, would you tell me what it really means someday? Maggie touched the small silver pin, a piece of her past that had brought everything full circle. Yes, when you're ready to hear the whole story, I'll tell you everything. For now, that promise would have to be enough. The full tale of Nighthawk Squadron and of Captain Margaret Donovan would take time to unfold. But after 30 years of silence, the truth was finally emerging, like a nighthawk taking flight in the gathering darkness. 3 weeks later, Maggie sat on the porch of her Pennsylvania home, watching the summer twilight settle over her garden. A cup of tea cooled on the table beside her, forgotten as she lost herself in memories that had grown more vivid since the day of James's graduation. The sound of a car on the gravel driveway drew her attention. James's blue sedan pulled up, and moments later, her son was walking toward the porch, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He had 3 weeks leave before reporting to the basic school at Quantico, where he would begin the next phase of his training as a Marine officer. Hey, Mom, he called, climbing the steps. Perfect timing, Maggie replied, rising to embrace him. Dinner's almost ready. Inside the house, as James settled his things in his old bedroom, Maggie put the finishing touches on the meal. There was an undercurrent of tension between them, not anger, but the awkwardness of navigating their relationship after such a significant revelation. They had spoken briefly by phone since the graduation, but this was their first face-to-face meeting since the day Captain Herrera had recognized her insignia and changed everything. Over dinner, they kept the conversation light, James's drive home, local news, mutual acquaintances. But Maggie could sense her son gathering his thoughts, preparing for a more serious discussion. Finally, as they cleared the dishes, James spoke. I've been doing some research. Couldn't find much, given the classified nature of Nighthawk Squadron, but there are whispers, references in obscure military history forums. Maggie nodded. I'm not surprised. Operations like ours leave traces, however faint. I found a declassified after-action report from Grenada that mentioned a helicopter crash. No details, just a brief reference to the loss of an aircraft and its pilot during an extraction operation. James studied his mother. That was you, wasn't it? Yes, Maggie confirmed, though as I told you, I survived the crash. James leaned against the counter. I've been trying to reconcile the mother I've known my whole life with the Marine officer Colonel Matthews and Captain Herrera described. It's challenging. Maggie dried her hands on a towel, then gestured toward the living room. Let's sit down. I think it's time I told you more about who I was before I became the person you know. In the living room, Maggie retrieved an old wooden box from a cabinet where it had remained hidden for decades. She placed it on the coffee table between them and opened it carefully. Inside were items she hadn't looked at in years, photographs, documents, a few medals, and various mementos from her previous life. After your father died, she began, I considered telling you the truth, but by then Margaret Donovan had been dead for 15 years. I had built a life as Margaret Sullivan, and that identity felt more real to me than my former self. James picked up a faded photograph showing a younger version of his mother in a flight suit, standing beside a helicopter. You really were a pilot. Yes, I joined the Marines in 1975 with a degree in aeronautical engineering. Women weren't allowed in combat roles then, but I was assigned to a training unit as a flight instructor. That's where I caught the attention of certain officers who were looking for candidates for special projects. She selected another photograph, this one showing a group of Marines in non-standard uniforms, their faces serious beneath the harsh sun of a desert training ground. In 1979, a joint special operations group was forming what would become Nighthawk Squadron. They needed pilots who could operate beyond conventional parameters, night flying without instruments, extreme low-altitude insertions and extractions, operations in denied areas. And they selected you, despite the restrictions on women in combat, James observed. The unit operated outside normal chains of command. The usual rules didn't always apply, Maggie explained. I was one of 12 pilots chosen and the only woman. We trained for 6 months in complete isolation before our first deployment. She handed James a small, worn notebook. This contains my mission logs, coded of course, but still a record of where we went and what we did. James opened the notebook, studying the cryptic entries. Lebanon, Libya, East Germany. You operated behind enemy lines in the Cold War. Our primary mission was extracting intelligence assets and special operations teams from hostile territory, Maggie confirmed. When conventional methods weren't possible or would create diplomatic incidents, Nighthawk Squadron was tasked with getting people out. How many missions? 47 over 4 years, Maggie said quietly. Some routine, some not so routine. James looked up from the notebook. The mission in Grenada, what happened? Maggie was silent for a moment, gathering her thoughts. This was the part of her story she had revisited least often in the years since. We were sent to extract a team of operators who had been compromised during the invasion. Their location was under heavy fire, and conventional extraction was deemed impossible due to anti-aircraft defenses in the area. She paused, the memories flooding back with surprising clarity. I flew in low, using terrain masking to avoid radar. We got the team on board, but during extraction we took fire from a position we hadn't identified. Her voice grew distant. The helicopter was hit in the tail rotor. I managed to maintain control long enough to reach the coastline, but we were going down. I put the chopper into the water about half a mile offshore, a controlled crash as much as possible. The team we'd extracted got out safely and swam to waiting boats. I was trapped in the cockpit as it began to sink. How did you survive? James asked, his voice hushed. One of the team members, a Navy SEAL, came back for me. He pulled me free just before the helicopter went under completely. I was unconscious, badly injured. He got me to a fishing boat nearby, but we were separated from the main extraction vessels. The fishermen took me to a small village where a local doctor treated my injuries. By the time I regained consciousness, the American forces had completed their operation and withdrawn. The SEAL who saved me had left me with the local doctor, presumably intending to report my location once he reconnected with his unit. But he didn't, James surmised. He was killed the next day in a separate operation, Maggie said quietly. I learned this much later. With no one knowing where I was and the confusion of the invasion's aftermath, I was listed as killed in action. She picked up one of the medals from the box, a Purple Heart in its case. This was awarded posthumously. Your father kept it after we married. I couldn't bring myself to destroy it, even though its official recipient no longer existed. James was quiet for a moment, absorbing everything. So when you realized everyone thought you were dead? I made a choice, Maggie admitted. I had been struggling before the crash, nightmares, anxiety, what we now recognize as classic PTSD symptoms. The missions were taking a toll. Some of the operations we conducted existed in moral gray areas that became harder to justify, even to myself. She looked directly at her son. When I learned I had been declared KIA, part of me felt released. Captain Donovan had died in that crash. I could become someone new, someone without the weight of those missions, those decisions, those losses. So you created Margaret Sullivan. Yes, I used some of my intelligence training to establish a new identity. I moved to Pennsylvania, enrolled in graduate school using my new name, and began building a different life. I never intended to mislead anyone. I simply wanted to start over. Until you met Dad, James said. Maggie smiled softly. Robert was different from anyone I'd known in my military life. Thoughtful, gentle, passionate about literature and history. When we fell in love, I knew I had to tell him the truth before we could have a future together. And he accepted it, James said. Accepted you. He did. He understood my need to leave that life behind, to become fully the person I was trying to be. He helped me legally change my name, using connections through the university to create a paper trail that would withstand scrutiny. We agreed that Margaret Donovan would remain in the past, and Margaret Sullivan would be my future. And then I came along, James said. Yes, and being your mother became the most important part of my identity, more real, more meaningful than anything that had come before. Maggie reached for her son's hand. That's why I want you to understand. While I may have hidden my past, the person who raised you wasn't a lie. The values I taught you, the love I gave you, that was all genuine. James nodded slowly. I believe you, Mom, but I still wish I had known the truth. All those times I talked about joining the Marines, about wanting to serve. You must have had such complicated feelings. I did, Maggie acknowledged. Part of me was proud seeing you drawn to service. Another part was terrified that you might face the same dangers, the same moral complexities that had nearly broken me. But mostly I respected that it was your choice to make, just as leaving had been mine. James picked up the Nighthawk insignia, which Maggie had returned to the box after the graduation. Tell me about this. What did it really mean to be part of Nighthawk's squadron? For the next several hours, Maggie shared stories she had kept buried for decades. She told James about night insertions into hostile territory, about extractions under fire, about the close-knit team that had become her family during those intense years. She spoke of the pride she had felt breaking barriers as a female Marine in specialized roles, and the toll that the secrecy and danger had eventually taken on her. As midnight approached, James asked the question that had clearly been on his mind throughout their conversation. Do you regret it? Not the service itself, but the decision to disappear, to leave that life behind. Maggie considered carefully before answering. I regret the pain my disappearance must have caused to those who cared about me. I regret not finding a way to heal that didn't require such a radical break from my past. But do I regret building the life I've had with you, becoming Margaret Sullivan? No, I don't. She looked at her son, now a Marine officer himself, and felt a surge of pride mixed with a new sense of connection. Seeing you in uniform at your graduation, it awakened something in me, a recognition that perhaps it's time to reconcile the two halves of my life, not to return to who I was, but to acknowledge that Captain Donovan is part of who Margaret Sullivan became. James nodded slowly. I think I understand, and I think Dad would have been proud to see you reclaiming that part of yourself. I think so too, Maggie agreed softly. So what happens now? James asked. Will you contact Colonel Matthews, Captain Herrera, let people know you're alive after all these years? I'm not sure, Maggie admitted. There would be complications, questions. The official record would be difficult to correct after so long, but perhaps some discreet reconnections might be possible. She smiled slightly. One step at a time, as we used to say in flight training. James looked thoughtful. You know, there's an organization for female Marine veterans that meets monthly at the community center. Many of them served during your era. Would you consider attending sometime? The suggestion touched Maggie deeply. It represented not just acceptance of her past, but James's desire to help her integrate it into her present life. Maybe, she said, when you're back from the basic school, perhaps we could go together. They talked late into the night, mother and son discovering new dimensions to their relationship as the barriers of secrecy fell away. When they finally said goodnight, James paused at the bottom of the stairs. Mom, thank you for telling me everything. It means more than I can say. Thank you for listening, Maggie replied, and for understanding. After James went upstairs, Maggie returned to the living room and carefully repacked the wooden box. But this time, she placed it on the bookshelf rather than hiding it away. A small step, but symbolic of the change that had begun the day a Marine captain recognized her insignia and froze in disbelief. She had come to Quantico only to watch her son graduate. She had left with the beginning of a reconciliation between the woman she had been and the woman she had become. Captain Margaret Donovan and Margaret Sullivan, two identities separated by time and circumstance, were finally, gradually, becoming integrated parts of a whole life. The small silver Nighthawk insignia that had triggered this journey now rested openly in its box on her shelf, no longer a hidden remnant of a secret past, but an acknowledged part of her story, a story she could now, at last, share with the son who was forging his own path in the same proud service she had once called home.